You're live.
Everyone that's still in town will
Stand
be
up.
on the discussion panel.
Yep, you're live.
Before John came up, I couldn't even just describe it until you saw it for yourself, so I didn't try. But like I said, everyone here has done some significant homework. And I saw John and Richard both speak. I used to go to UFO conferences to hawk my stuff, and I felt like the Lord has really changed my direction in some senses, where I can sit and listen and learn. No matter what you believe about the UFO phenomena, there's incontrovertible evidence that has to be incorporated into your worldview. You can't refute this stuff. Richard's going to present more. David Serrate is going to present more. It may seem like we're just preaching to the choir, because half of you at least are already believers. But they're equipping you for what you need to convince skeptics with. I saw Richard and I said, I've got to get this guy one day. So thank you for being here, sir. Pleasure to introduce Richard Dolan. Thank you, John.
I'd like to thank Guy Malone and for his efforts to get me here, and really enjoying being here in Roswell speaking for on this topic to you guys. Does anyone know, is there a way to turn this lamp on? No? Okay, that's fine. Regarding this topic of UFOs, there are many places you can stand along the spectrum of belief. So at the one hand, there are people who look at this as nonsense, let's say, and who don't take it seriously. I think there's nothing to this. On the other hand, on the other extreme, you have people who say, oh yeah, I know all about UFOs, and I can tell you what these things are and what these beings are, where they're from. I can cite what chapter and verse in the Bible that proves it. Or I can tell you from my latest channeling session what they plan. Whatever. And then in between those extremes is an entire range of where a person may stand as far as what they think about this topic. And it's just so regarding how you approach this topic personally. In other words, you might simply be interested in reading about case after case of interesting UFO reports, the way someone might read a mystery novel, for fun or entertainment. You might be a dogged researcher pounding at the door of where FOIA documents are being kept, like John. Other researchers who go out into the field and analyze cases, interview witnesses. That's hard work and extremely important, obviously. You might prefer a more detached scientific approach, that is, analyzing photographs, videos, or material samples, that type of thing. You might do more hypothetical studies, such as analyzing how likely it is that life exists elsewhere in the universe, or studying possible advanced forms of propulsion technology. You may engage in a lot of specialized studies as well, like abduction studies, crop circle studies, animal mutilation studies, if you think these are relevant to UFOs. And then other people study spiritual aspects of all of this. And other people look at elements of UFOs as a popular culture, as a form of psychosocial phenomenon, focusing their lens on the believers rather than the events themselves specifically. Now, every way to do this has its own merits, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Ideally, every one of them can help us arrive at some destination approximating truth. My approach is to look at UFOs as history, in particular to examine historical documents to learn whether or not there has been any government or military engagement in this topic, an interest in this topic, and as John pointed out, the answer is yes. I'm going to go into some detail about that. If the answer is yes, you might ask why. Why are they interested? And I would be the first to acknowledge that analyzing government documents is not maybe as good as having a piece of flying saucer to analyze or an alien body to put on display and analyze, but it's not bad either. I mean, after all, if we can prove that elements within the U.S. military, intelligence community, government have taken the UFO phenomenon very seriously, and if these reports indicate that this is indeed extraordinary, and even possibly alien, well, you know, that's enough work for a day. I mean, because they've been telling the public the opposite for years. So there's our Great Discrepancy. UFOs are dismissed as a non-topic, a joke, by the academic world, by the scientific world, by the media, by the political establishments of our civilization. For people in these social circles, if you show an interest in this subject, you're committing professional suicide. So what would it mean if we discovered that within the classified world, people have taken this very seriously? Well, it so happens that this is the case. For many years, it was very difficult to get government documents about UFOs. During the 1950s and 60s, for instance, there were a few classified documents back then that did wend their way into the public domain. But this was quite rare. In 1974, the U.S. government amended its Freedom of Information Act, and John talked a lot about this. I would suggest that in the mid to late 1970s and into the early 80s, what we had was a veritable golden age of the Freedom of Information Act. In fact, a golden age that lasted, I would say, till 1982, when an executive order was issued that curtailed many of the user-friendly features of that act. Government documents continue to be released on UFOs, of course, but there really has been there hasn't been a repeat, in my view, of that great flood of the late 70s and early 80s. There are, of course, unverified government documents, too. I mean, we can call them alleged government documents. I'm thinking, of course, of the MJ-12 documents and the Majestic documents, which you can find in many places on the web. These documents, you know what? They may be authentic. They may not be authentic. But the documents containing the information released of the Freedom of Information Act are not open to dispute. And as I said, considering how marginalized this subject is from the mainstream culture, if you make the point that this is serious to those people who have real power, then that's a lot. I try to keep in mind when I go to a conference that I talked about that spectrum of belief. Most people you would call, believers in UFOs, but I always try to guide my remarks to a number of skeptics that would be out there, in particular journalists, media people. And I feel it's important for all of us who are involved in this field to remember that outside this room, outside this building, most people think we're kind of nutty. And they think this topic is, or more accurately, what you find is there are a lot of people who secretly think this is kind of neat and kind of interesting, but they don't realize that many other people feel that way. And so when you talk about official organs of truth, that is media, official media, we get this ridicule factor. And so when I do my discussions on this, I try very hard to not do any grandstanding and not to insert my personal opinions on this as much as I try to delineate facts to make a case. And the case is that this is a real, valid, serious phenomenon. Is it alien? Well, I think some of it is, yes. But what I think doesn't really matter a heck of a lot as compared with what we know is true. Now, I said, if this is a serious topic, a skeptic could still say, well, yeah, sure, the government's taken UFOs seriously, but that doesn't mean that it's alien. One thing you get from some of these knee-jerk skeptics are these glib statements like, well, sure, they were interested in UFOs, but they were just hiding the U-2 aircraft or the Blackbird or some other classified project that we have no right to know about since we live in an empire, not a republic. Don't you remember that? Get with the times, man. I will be addressing the ours, theirs problem regarding UFOs as I move along here. You'll see where I stand on that. For now, I just want to stay a little closer to the shore and look at some of these documents. If you're a UFO researcher, or if you're just someone with a long-standing interest in this topic, I'm guessing a lot of these are going to be reasonably well known to you. However, every one of these documents continues to remain almost completely unknown to the wider public. And keep that in mind. And besides, some things are so obvious that they become invisible. So we start with the Twining Memo. I think for very good reason, this is one of the most well-known, important UFO documents. On September 23, 1947, right at the beginning of the modern UFO era, General Nathan Twining, who was the head of the Air Material Command over at Wright Airfield, wrote a classified letter to Air Force General George Shulgin regarding these flying discs. Twining said the objects were real, not visionary or fictitious. They may possibly be natural phenomena, he wrote, such as meteors, but, as he said, the reported operating characteristics, such as extreme rates of climb, maneuverability, particularly in roll, and action which must be considered evasive when sighted, lend belief to the possibility that some of the objects are controlled either manually, automatically, or remotely. And then Twining listed several descriptions, common descriptions of UFOs. They generally were silent, he wrote, had a metallic or light-reflecting surface, no trail, were circular or elliptical in shape, and often flat on the bottom. Many descriptions indicated a dome on top. Several reports indicated that they flew in formation. That's quite specific information indeed. UFO skeptics point out regarding this statement of Twining, they said, well, he wrote also that no wreckage of a flying disc had been recovered. And that's true, he did write that, and after all, you'd think, well, Twining would be in a position to know. But what we don't know, of course, is whether Twining would have been able to tell Shulgin about a UFO crash, if such a thing happened. If Shulgin did not have a need to know, Twining clearly could not have confirmed such a thing. This is important to remember when you look at these documents. I may have a certain classification level. If I'm writing a note to someone with a lower classification level, I can't exceed what that person's classification level allows. You get that a lot in these documents. It happens. On the other hand, Twining did state to Shulgin that UFOs were not secret American aircraft. And that seems to have come as a surprise to Shulgin, who was expected to learn that, there's nothing to this affair, don't investigate it, don't worry about it. That's not what Twining said. So the question arises after that, though, is could Twining have been hiding the fact that UFOs really were U.S. experimental aircraft? And it's a fair question. However, we are more than half a century away from this letter. And it has to be said that the answer, in my view, seems to be a very clear no. I mean, there is not yet any credible evidence that the U.S. had any craft in 1947 that could duplicate the reported maneuvers of flying saucers. Why would Twining tell Shulgin to keep studying flying saucers if they were just classified American aircraft? If there were good reasons for doing so, we don't know of any of these reasons. Now, Twining's letter is a crucial document in the history of UFO policy. It was actually did not get any official acknowledgement for 20 years. This is a very interesting document from W.D. Wentworth, Colonel Chief of the Operations Branch at Air Material Command. This is from October of 1947, and there's not a lot in there, but what's in there is significant. And he writes, for your information, the Air Material Command at Wright Field is making a study of this subject, flying saucers, and is constructing models to be tested in a wind tunnel. As a guide in constructing the models, descriptions from various persons who claim to have sighted these objects were used. The Air Material Command is of the opinion that some sort of object, such as the flying saucer, did exist. So they were making models. They were flying in wind tunnels, flying saucers in 1947. Quite significant. By the end of 1947, beginning of 48, there were a number of people pondering what was actually going on here. In the classified world, I'm talking. In the public world, in the newspapers, none of this really came out, but there were speculations, well, are these Soviets? That's the first question you want to know. When you have objects being seen over your classified installations, which I'm going to show you in a moment, you want to know, did the Russians come up with some kind of exotic new system of aviation that we need to know about? It's a serious question. And this was looked into. Is this American? Well, that's certainly a question that continually needs to be asked. You had people wondering natural phenomena, misidentification of ordinary objects, and yes, there were speculations as early as the beginning of 48 that we know of about interplanetary origins of these objects. Although, oh, I knocked something over here. Someone's pen. Even by the beginning of 1948, some of these were a real stretch, I think, for some of the more difficult cases. I think natural phenomena was being considered a stretch. I mean, when you read the Twining Memo, it's very difficult to explain that as natural phenomena when you really read his descriptions of these objects. We also know that no later than the middle of 1948, I missed my note here, beg your pardon. No, I didn't. Let's move ahead here. Yeah, what we know is by 1948, this was serious, and it was secret. Ask yourself, were there any conclusions arrived at in later years to alter this consensus? The answer is no. Harry Truman. By the middle of 1948, Harry Truman was receiving briefings on UFOs. We know this. How do we know it? From that man down there, Colonel, later General Robert Landry, who in a 1974, oral history interview, after Truman had died, in fact, Landry was being interviewed about his career in the Air Force and things that he did. And at the very end of this interview, the interviewer said, "Hey, what about UFOs?" And Landry, I think, was caught off guard and talked a little bit about it. So the following is an excerpt from Landry's comments on the UFO controversy. I want to read a little bit to this. He was talking about 1948. Landry said that because of all the media attention given to flying saucers, that the president, he says, like any other citizen, is exposed to all these goings-on. Yeah, I would think so. So Landry was called into the Oval Office. Truman wanted to see him. They talked about UFO reports. Truman said, if there is any evidence of a strategic threat to national security, then the collection and evaluation of UFO data by the CIA warranted more intense study and attention at the highest governmental level. Those were Landry's words. So Truman directed Landry to report quarterly to him after consulting with CIA about UFOs. All reports were to be made orally, unless, said Landry, it was considered by intelligence to be so serious or alarming as to warrant a more detailed report in writing. And Landry then said that during the 4.5 years in office there, all reports were made orally. Nothing, he said, of substance ever considered credible or threatening to the country was ever received from intelligence. Wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall in any of those meetings? By my count, that's 4.5 years. That's at least 18 meetings that Landry could have had with Truman. And, Truman was a busy man. We had the Korean War. We had the Berlin airlift. And he's having quarterly reports on UFOs. Why is that? You read Truman's memoirs. It's 2 volumes. There's not a word about flying saucers in those. So I think that's quite significant. Now, Landry downplayed Truman's interest in all this, but a couple of things stand out with what he said. One, that, you're giving the president quarterly briefings for 4.5 years. That's significant. 2, he confirms, as other people had claimed, that very early on the CIA did have an interest in UFO reports. The CIA, to this day, says, no, we really weren't back then. We had a brief interest in 1952 and 53, and then we kind of fell out of it. That's false. Landry's reports also, we have to point out, this is important, were made orally. Now, he interpreted that to mean that they were therefore not significant, but any intelligence officer will know oral reports are exactly the best way to deliver sensitive information. They're undocumented, they're untraceable. Richard Helms, who directed CIA from the late 60s and into the early 70s, said, the best way to keep secrets is nothing on paper. So what we know is that these statements of Robert Landry confirm an interest in UFO phenomenon at the highest level of the U.S. government, that is the office of the president himself. Now, this is an FBI memo. I think at least as interesting as a Twining memo, possibly more so. On January 31st, 1949, the FBI issued a memo on UFOs entitled Protection of Vital Installations. This was a classified document sent to J. Edgar Hoover, sent to the Army's G2, sent to the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. This memo mentions, among other things, that there was a meeting among these particular groups concerning UFOs, and here's the key statement. Army intelligence has recently said that the matter of unidentified aircraft or unidentified aerial phenomena, otherwise known as flying discs, flying saucers, and balls of fire, is considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and the Air Forces. This was a year and a half into the modern flying saucer era. All the while, government sources had been telling the public that this phenomenon was just a combination of hoaxes, hallucinations, conventional aircraft, and misidentification of natural phenomena, and here we have a document stating exactly otherwise. Why was this considered top secret? Well, you get the answer in this memo. It describes a near collision by an Eastern Airlines plane with a large rocket type of craft with windows, the witnesses said, and traveling at a speed of 2,700 miles per hour. More serious, the memo explained, were various invasions of sensitive airspace by unidentified objects in the vicinity of the Atomic Energy Commission's installation at Los Alamos, New Mexico. In fact, airspace violations appear to have been going on at many sensitive places, such as Hanford Atomic Energy Commission plant in the state of Washington. And this memo describes objects round in form, attempted jet interceptions, and went on to say that all units, including the anti-aircraft battalion, radar units, Air Force fighter squadrons, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have been alerted for further observation. And yet another fascinating report, this one from 1951. This is another document that says, trying to think, here it is, object described. This is an encounter by a pilot at Lawson Air Force Base, and described as flat on top and bottom, appearing from a front view to have rounded edges, slightly beveled. The detail is as interesting as anything else. Described as traveling at tremendous speed, disturbance in the air described as a bump when the object passed by the pilot. The pilot was a combat fighter in Europe, highly respected. And, I wonder if Truman ever saw this report. He's getting briefings from Landry. Did he see this? Who knows? Landry said there weren't any reports of interest. Well, I think that's of interest. Of course, Landry said this in 1974, which is just before the Great Flood of Freedom of Information Act documents. This document wasn't available to contradict him when he made his statement. Who's going to argue with him? But look at it. There it is. We have several documents that from places like Air Force Intelligence and the CIA suggesting that the official explanations of all this were totally inadequate. And I want to go into a little bit about that. So 1952 comes along, and this is a very important year in the history of the UFO. Across the U.S., sightings skyrocketed, not just by civilians, but within the military world also. At the end of July, by mid-July, this whole thing peaked. There were 2 weekends in a row, 3 actually, 2 that got a lot of publicity of objects being seen over the White House, tracked on radar. That photograph on the right is under dispute. A lot of people say, no, those lights are the reflections of the ground lights. Other people dispute that. I don't really know. It's a nice picture, though. The people involved in the sightings over D.C., most of them were adamant that this was not temperature phenomena, weather phenomena, which was the official explanation the Air Force gave. I mean, this was such a big deal. It made the front page of the New York Times, and it prompted the largest Air Force press conference since the end of World War II, when General John Sanford, who's actually sitting on the right side The man on the left is General Roger Ramey, who is for those of you who know about Roswell, of course, was the man who deflated the Roswell story when he was over in Fort Worth. Ramey helped Sanford do damage control in 1952 regarding this UFO flap. Anyway, the explanation that the Air Force gave the world was that the sightings and radar returns over Washington were caused by weather phenomena. It is very obvious that within the classified world, this explanation did not wash. I don't have it on here, but there's a document that came from Air Force intelligence that described lack of belief that the Air Force had been able to solve this problem. There's a CIA document. Do I have it here? Yeah, here we go. All right. So, right, that's the official explanation. And then in general, the Air Force and other sources are saying that there's nothing to all this. There's a document that came out at the very end of July 1952 as a result of the Air Force press conference that said the Air Force has failed to arrive at any satisfactory conclusion, ruled out Soviets most likely, discussed the possibility that UFOs were alien. There it is again. We don't know what they are. Maybe they're natural, and we send jet interceptors after them. Then on the left there is a CIA bit from a CIA report describing this with the statement, sightings of UFOs reported at Los Alamos and Oak Ridge at a time when the background radiation count had risen inexplicably. Here we run out of even blue yonder explanations that might be tenable and are left with numbers of incredible reports from credible observers from August of '52. So the point is that in the classified world in late 1952, these people were not satisfied with the official explanation. And there's another reason to be concerned. Truman was on his way out as president. If you think about this, since the UFO phenomenon really made its presence felt in the U.S., Truman had been president of the United States. The Democratic Party had been in power in the White House all that time. 1952 is an election year. Truman was not running. He was very unpopular, in fact, at that time. Eisenhower was running for the Republicans. It was widely understood that Eisenhower was a good bet to win. So I try to put myself in the minds of these guys and thinking, well, there's going to be a change of wind here. Now, Eisenhower is a reliable person, I think, from the point of view of national security, but still, change is not always a good thing. If you're in their position, you're thinking, new people coming in, what do we do about this problem after all? Well, there was a great crescendo in the classified world regarding how to deal with UFOs by the end of 1952. By December of '52, there was a memo to the director of the CIA, who was Walter Beadle Smith, who in fact was Eisenhower's chief of staff during World War II. It's a memo by H. Marshall Chadwell, who was the director of the scientific office at CIA, says to Smith, at this time, this is in December, the reports of incidents convince us that there is something going on which must have immediate attention. Sightings of unexplained objects at great altitudes and traveling at high speeds in the vicinity of major U.S. defense installations are of such nature that they are not attributable to natural phenomena or known types of aerial vehicles. How much more explicit does one want? This is another of these documents that we received through the late 1970s through FOIA. This document bears very, very close scrutiny. As a result, what was going on is that the Robertson panel, what became known as the Robertson panel, was a classified meeting that took place in January 1953 that was kind of like the early version of the Condon Report in a sense for the classified world. What the Robertson panel did was essentially say, they met for a few hours. It was the last weekend of Truman's presidency is when this met. And this is all rush. Let's get this done before Eisenhower comes in. They wrapped up a day and a half, 2 days before Eisenhower took office. Robertson panel finished on January 18th. Eisenhower took office on January 20th, 1953. The result of the Robertson panel was essentially the gutting of Project Blue Book, which was the official public investigative body of UFOs. They were, as John very correctly pointed out, The extremely important UFO reports often did not go through Blue Book channels. But at least in 52, Blue Book was a real, valid, viable operation led by a captain who really believed in investigating this. That was Edward Ruppelt. So Blue Book was actually doing some serious work that year, and Blue Book was gutted as a result of the Robertson panel's recommendations. But just because the Robertson panel essentially try to put UFOs to sleep within the classified world, and why would they do that, by the way? Why would they do that? Well, my own feeling is that there were always groups that received important UFO information. But I think that by 1952, this was perceived as a real problem. I think that military leadership and intelligence leadership probably realized that we are losing control, even within the military, on this topic. And this is going to be reported a little more strictly now. And as a matter of fact, the JANAP reports did not originate in the 1960s. JANAP started in 1953-54, as well as the service reporting. And I think this also was in response to the clampdown by the Robertson panel. Nevertheless, the UFO party continued through the 50s. Everyone knows about Roswell. Not everyone knows about Oak Ridge. The nuclear facility at Oak Ridge in Tennessee housed some of the world's most sophisticated technology. And Oak Ridge, of course, is one of the key Manhattan Project sites where the atomic bomb was partly developed. In 1947, we all know nuclear technology was cutting edge, and the U.S. government severely restricted access to it. And keeping in mind that America had a monopoly of atomic weapons. This issue was considered so important around the world, by the way, that there was a strong opinion in the UN and internationally that the U.S. should make atomic technology entrusted to the UN. It was a very big issue at the time. People forget now. America's answer was, sorry, no dice. This is the quickest way to give this to the Soviets. We're not going to do that. Thank you very much. But something violating the airspace at Oak Ridge, violations occurred as early as 1947. Something, according to declassified FBI documents, without authorization, were hanging out there. The object, in fact, was photographed by a civilian employee, a resident engineer with Air Material Command. There was an FBI memo to Hoover that said at least 24 copies of that photograph had been made. Must have been pretty interesting. And that an unnamed source asked the employee to recover all of them and bring them to Air Force intelligence, and he complied. According to the FBI document, the witness added that the person asking for the photos, who was an unnamed intelligence officer, had appeared extremely concerned over the matter and seemed quite emphatic that the matter should be given no more publicity than was absolutely necessary. Now, these violations over Oak Ridge were not a one-time occurrence, by no means. They continued regularly through the 1950s, at least the early half of the 50s. We know this. Many of them were radar sightings, many of them were visual, some were both. These events caused great concern at the FBI office in Knoxville, and also at the U.S. Third Army, and also at the Atomic Energy Commission. A classified FBI report here. This one's not FBI, I'm sorry. This is an Atomic Energy Commission report from July of '53. Described a black object moving out of a high white cloud seen for about 5 minutes. At times the object appeared to be long and narrow, at other times round. Here's a quote from the report. This object was extremely black in color, having an appearance of a deep black metal exterior with a fine gloss. It did not leave a vapor trail, or were there any lights of shine noticed. No sound was heard. The object flew east at a tremendous speed for what appeared to be approximately 3 miles, where it stopped. The object was then joined by 2 more of these same objects. A formation similar to a spread V was formed, and the objects, at a tremendous speed, flew in an eastward direction. Now, I'd like to ask a really simple question. What does that? Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in charge of security at Oak Ridge, I'd want to know what's flying over here. Well, so did they. You didn't just fly over Oak Ridge. but something did, many times without any authorization. If you're interested in reasons for secrecy about UFOs, you can start right there. Or with this statement from an emergency report from Maxwell Air Force Base in 1954. This is a report sent to the commander of Air Defense Command in Colorado. Describes the entry into airspace of a, quote, strange stationary object, variable in brilliance, which moved rapidly, then returned to its original position. The base sent a helicopter to check it out. Definitely not a star, said the pilot. The object received a lot of attention. A lot of people watched it from the tower. A civilian tower radioed that it had it in sight also. The object became dimmer and then faded. Could this have been a star? Possibly, I guess. But it has to be emphasized that the personnel at the time asked the same question, and they said it wasn't. According to the report, the pilot of helicopter wished to stress fact that the object was of a saucer-like nature, was stationary at 2,000 feet, and would be glad to be called upon to verify any statement and act as witness. Jumping ahead, there were no shortage of good UFO reports for the rest of the 50s and through the early 60s. There were quite a few. But I'm skipping them. I think you get the idea what I'm talking about here. I do want to mention this case, however. This is early in the morning of March 16, 1967 at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. We get yet another extraordinary event. Again, something completely unknown to the larger culture, this event, to our officially established truths. You ask most journalists, most even military historians, I don't think they would know about this. But it happened just the same. Under a very clear, dark Montana sky, an airman at one of the flight launch control centers saw a star-like object zigzag high above him. Soon, a larger and closer light also appeared and acted in a similar way. The airman called his NCO. The two guys are watching the lights streak through the sky. They're maneuvering in all impossible ways. The NCO phoned his commander, a man named Robert Salas, who was below ground at the time at the Launch Control Center. Great, Salas says, you just keep watching those things and let me know if they get any closer. He was dubious about this, to say the least. A couple of minutes later, the NCO called Salas, shouting into the phone that a red glowing UFO was hovering outside the front gate. What do you want us to do? He says to Salas. Salas said, well, make sure that the site is secure, and I'll go phone command post. So he woke up his commander and briefed him. At that time, as he's briefing him, an alarm went off in their little capsule. Both of these men see a no-go light turn on for one of the missiles. And within seconds, several more missiles went down in succession. 20 miles away at another launch facility, all connected here, the same scenario was taking place. The first lieutenant was at his station when one of the Minuteman missiles went into no-go status. He called the missile site, learned that a UFO had been hovering over the site. Just then, 10 more ICBMs in rapid succession reported a no-go condition. The entire flight was down. They sent strike teams to the two launch facilities where maintenance crews were already at work. The strike teams got there and reported that all of the maintenance and security personnel had been watching UFOs hovering at each of the sites. These missiles were down for most of the day. Neither the Air Force investigation nor the laboratory tests at Boeing found any cause for these shutdowns. According to the Boeing engineering chief, he said there was no technical explanation that could explain the event. Of course, UFOs were not part of his analysis. What happened in the late 60s was that this topic really hit a crescendo. UFO sightings were widespread in the 1960s. The Air Force was losing credibility on this. People would make fun of Project Blue Book. There were jokes. Air Force is trying to fight a war in Vietnam, and now you got this albatross around your neck that you can't get rid of. Air Force had been trying to unload Blue Book for years. They tried to give it to the National Science Foundation. No dice. Other organizations No one wanted Project Blue Book. But the Air Force was not able to just disband it. They had a hard time justifying that. I mean, they had been telling the public for years that UFOs were not a matter of national security, but the Air Force realized that if you just summarily close this down, that looks bad too. You need some kind of justification for doing so, and they were not able to get it. So things reached a head in 1966. There were a bunch of sightings that actually got the attention of Congress, including Gerald Ford, as a congressman of Michigan, made a big deal out of this. There was a recommendation known as the O'Brien Commission. It's little known, but which recommended strengthening Blue Book, God forbid, from the Air Force point of view. So at the Air Force, there was a strong move by, in particular, the civilian organization called NICAP, to press for congressional investigations of UFOs. And there is no way the Air Force was going to sanction this. What the Air Force did was very, very astute, which was they took the initiative and they found a university, the University of Colorado, which would conduct what they said would be a scientific analysis of UFOs and settle the matter once and for all. An independent investigation. It became known as the Condon Committee because of it was led by Edward U. Condon, who's pictured right there. You can see Condon's attitude about UFOs in that photograph. Ha ha, big joke. Condon, in fact, throughout the entire program, which the study lasted from 67 until through 1967 and all of 1968, Condon made a lot of public comments disparaging UFOs throughout. Really angered a lot of people. But the idea was, well, they're doing their study and we're going to find out what happens. Well, what happened was there was a mutiny midway through the program by a number of the researchers involved in this, who correctly surmised that Condon and his assistant, Robert Lowe, were opposed, absolutely opposed, to a positive conclusion regarding UFOs. And this is true. They discovered, midway into the project, a particular memo that Robert Lowe had written just before they accepted the project from the Air Force. And Lowe was describing, well, how are we going to do this study? He said, well, the trick would be to describe the project so that to the public it would appear a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. When one of the scientists on the project, Roy Craig, who recently passed away, he found that memo going through the files. He said later, and Craig was a loyal Condon supporter, by the way, but Craig said, my heart was in my throat when I read that memo, because he knew. And this was confirmation of Lowe's attitude. Lowe himself, I am nearly certain, was himself CIA. There's a source on Lowe that describes a CIA operation in Albania in 1948 with Robert Lowe, and also Kim Philby was involved in that operation for the British. It was an abortive program, didn't work. I'm pretty sure it's the same Robert Lowe. We do know Lowe was in intelligence at that time. All these intelligence guys, they find their way into the UFO field. They all do. Anyway, you know what? The Condon Committee was messy, but it did the job. Because even though you had a lot of unhappy people there, even though there was a lot of bad feeling, the report came out. Condon writes the conclusion, says there's nothing to UFOs, they're really not worthy of scientific study. Air Force says, boom, thank you very much, we're closing Blue Book. The report itself had 30% of the cases in there were unexplained, which was extraordinary. And of those 30%, a couple of them, 2 of the reports were within a hair's breadth of admitting reality of UFOs as something possibly alien. But a lot of people have speculated Condon may not have even have read the entire report. It's quite possible. Certainly journalists didn't. The report was just issued. The following day, everyone who had time to read a 900-page report. This is what the Air Force did, of course, with Roswell, this first Roswell report, this massive thing. Who the heck's going to read such a poorly organized and poorly written document? The problem with the Condon Committee, a lot of people have said, well, it's really good that the Air Force ended Blue Book because it was a charade. That is true. Blue Book was a joke. It was absolutely only designed to explain away UFOs, not to explain them. And it was a public relations endeavor. That is all true. However, Blue Book was a kind of wedge through which UFO researchers could try to force out UFO information. And with the closing of Blue Book, that wedge was gone. This, I argue, is an undermining of democratic rule. Because you see a UFO after 1969, where do you go? You have no place to go. There was a memo that also appeared in 1969, the Dolan Memo. This is well known, classified memo, which confirmed that reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JANAP 146 or Air Force Manual 5511 and are not part of the Blue Book system. Confirmation that Blue Book was not taking the serious national security UFO reports. What the Condon Report did and what the closing of Blue Book did was it removed UFOs from the realm of public government interaction. That's what it did. That's why it's significant. It didn't mean that the military stopped investigating it. It means that the military gave itself a legal basis for lying to you about it. UFOs, whoever's in charge of those things, they don't seem to care about what the U.S. government tells you. They fly around and do their thing anyway. In the spring of 1974, there was a significant wave. This is not very well known. Not widely known, I guess, of very well-documented sightings, most of which involve European military personnel. In particular, we have a lot of data from Spain. Many of these reports found their way into the files of the US DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And here are 2 pages of those DIA reports. They essentially came from local newspaper clippings, organized in nice military fashion, and forwarded to the Pentagon, strictly, as I said, for the information of those parties interested, whoever those would be. There are some interesting accounts. Some clearly indicate unusual maneuvering capabilities, such as this. Round, intense, torch-like light rose out of the water near a huge rock, traveled at low altitude, then fell into the water again. This happened twice. Or unconventional shapes, oval objects, rhomboid, saucer-shaped objects. And quite a few sightings of beings, incidentally. One truck driver saw what he described as 3 silver ships on the highway with light similar to floodlight. Figures approached him. He freaked out, ran, they followed. He threw himself onto the ground. They approached to within 6 feet, he said. He said they were tall, maybe 2 meters, maybe 6.5 feet tall. Had arms and legs, but he couldn't make out faces. And then they eventually returned to their ships and left, he said. The next day, a civil defense unit investigated and found a distinctive hole in the ground. They didn't know what it was. Truck driver said he didn't make that. These reports don't prove that aliens are here, but although it would not be hard to speculate along those lines. But if we treat them cautiously, we can still make some important conclusions. First, the quality of the Spanish reports tells us that people were seeing and experiencing something very unusual, something that appeared to be technological and intelligent, the technology of which strongly appeared to be beyond any capabilities that we had. I mean, objects going in and out of water. Secondly, the U.S. Defense Department doesn't seem to have believed that these reports were nonsense. I mean, they were carefully culled from local sources, organized, packaged, and sent on to unspecified interested parties. Well, of course they'd be interested in this. Who would not be? This is the kind of thing that can really frustrate a UFO researcher, by the way. This is exactly the kind of material that we're interested in, and we get laughed at or dismissed for this. But the military is interested in this. During late 1975, another extraordinary series of events, airspace violations, took place, this time along the entire length of the U.S. northern border with Canada. It involves several military bases from Montana as far as Maine. Airspace incursions also took place throughout much of 1976. All are unexplained to this day in any conventional manner. And one of these occurred on October 31st, 1975 at Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan. Wurtsmith is closed now, but on that night, an airman saw what appeared to be running lights of a low-flying craft, possibly a helicopter, he wondered, near the southern perimeter of the base. It was heading westerly. One light was pointed down, he said. 2 red lights were near the back. The object was either silent or very, very quiet. A little later, another witness saw several lights near the western edge of the base. The lights turned north and appeared to lose altitude. Most of the witnesses heard nothing, although one person claimed to hear a quiet sound similar to a helicopter, which then faded almost immediately. Then, 3 times within the next 11 minutes, at the back of the base, security police reported that an object with no lights, possibly a helicopter, entered the base and hovered very low over the weapons storage area. Radar personnel, meanwhile, were reporting low-flying objects, plural objects, in the area. At the northern perimeter of the base, one of the crafts briefly turned its lights on. There was a KC-135 tanker in the vicinity. It was flying to the base at this time, and it was ordered to intercept and identify whatever this was. So the crew tracked this. The object started moving south from the base, down the lake, and the tanker's following it. They thought for a while it was a single craft. They're going for about 35 miles southeast from the base. However, then they decide that no, it's actually 2 objects communicating with each other with irregular flashing lights. The radar from the aircraft could not get a fix for longer than 10 seconds at a time. And every time they tried to close on the objects simply pulled away. The crew lost the objects among fishing boat lights in Saginaw Bay. So they started back. Here is how the story ends, as told to by the navigator to the base historian a few years later. He says, on the way back, we picked the UFO up again at our 8 o'clock position. We turned away and it proceeded to follow us. Finally, we turned back in the direction of the UFO and it really took off in the direction of the Bay Area. I know this might sound crazy, but I would estimate the UFO sped away from us doing approximately 1,000 knots. He goes on, I remember that while on final approach to Wurtsmith, we saw the lights again near the weapons storage area. Following the mission, we discussed the incident, and about a week later, Captain Higginbottom, that's the captain of the plane, was questioned by OSI and cautioned not to discuss the incident. 1,000 knots, that's more than 1,000 miles an hour. It's pretty fast. Could this have been a helicopter? Logical question to ask. Well, if so, it would have to have outperformed what was then the most advanced helicopter in the world, and that was the recently built prototype of what became known as the Apache helicopter, which first flew as a prototype in fall of 1975. For the record, the Apache's capabilities, I mean, they're extraordinary. There's an excellent aircraft, but in no way can do this. Absolutely not. Not even today with any of its enhancements, it cannot do that. I mean, this thing took off with the speed of a jet fighter. It had the hovering capability of a helicopter, silent though, and had the ability to accelerate like at a jet aircraft without noise. And of course, this still begs the question, who was responsible for this? I'm wondering how much I should go into this, but probably not. I mean, this is during the wave of 75, there were many of these encounters. The one at Malmstrom Air Force Base a week after the Wurtsmith is equally extraordinary. And this is over a series of a couple of nights. And you can just read the quote there. Personnel at 4 SAC sites reported observing intercepting F-106s arrive in areas. Sighted objects turned off their lights upon arrival of interceptors and back on again upon their departure. Playing cat and mouse games. Objects could not be intercepted. 2 tracks were apparent on height finder radars. Okay, many of the areas at the base reported these sightings, radar and visual, unknown objects. Cannon Air Force Base, New Mexico, again. This is in January 1976. 2 UFOs reported near the flight line. Again, lots of detail. Brief report, but security police observing them reported them to be 25 yards in diameter, gold or silver in color, with blue light on top, hole in the middle, red light on bottom. It's fairly explicit. Fort Ritchie in Maryland, again. The Iranian report from 1976. This is one of the most vividly described UFO encounters in Defense Department records. I'm sure that many of you are well familiar with this case. It's been recounted many times. But you know, if there's a journalist out there and you've never heard of this case, listen up. This report describes an extremely advanced vehicle, easily outperforming 2 Iranian F-4 jet fighters. What had happened was that Tehran residents had phoned the local airbase about a strange light in the sky. The senior officer goes outside and to look, and he saw it. So he scrambled an F-4 to intercept. The pilot of the F-4 reported seeing the object. It was extremely bright, he said, easily visible 70 miles away. At a distance of about 25 miles from this object, the F-4 lost all instrumentation and communication. The systems only returned to normal after the jet had turned around to go back. 10 minutes later, another F-4 was scrambled. About 30 miles from the object, the crew obtained a radar lock, but the UFO easily maintained its distance. It was still intensely bright. The pilot noticed rapid flashing lights arranged in a rectangular pattern, alternating blue, green, red, and orange. As the F-4 continued its pursuit, a second bright object detached from the original object and headed straight for them at a high rate of speed. Kind of an alarming thing, I'd say. So the pilot immediately turns a sharp turn and dives, but the object continued to pursue his plane within a distance of like 3 miles. The object turned inside the arc of the F-4 as it was turning, and then returned, in the words of the memo, for a perfect rendezvous with the main UFO. As soon as those 2 UFOs joined, another object detached from it, rapidly descended, then apparently slowed down and cast a bright light over a 2-mile area. The F-4 flew low over the area to try to get the exact location of the object, then returned to the base. And on their final approach, incidentally, the crew noticed a cylindrical-shaped UFO with bright, steady lights on each end and a flasher in the middle. And this object passed directly over the F-4. The control tower operator didn't notice anything. He said, well, I don't see anything there. And the pilot then specifically told him where to look, at which time he saw the object. And then during their landing, they experienced a variety of technical difficulties too. So all in this report. There was an addendum, a handwritten addendum to the report, which noted, it said, an outstanding report. This case is a classic which meets all the criteria necessary for a valid study of the UFO phenomenon. It's a DIA memo. And by the way, the same night as this encounter was a heck of a sighting in Morocco. Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State, was consulted on that UFO sighting, and basically shut his own embassy in Morocco out of the loop. He gave them the tired story that the Condon Committee had laid UFOs to rest. He said, well, maybe what you saw was a meteor, although the details of that case, which I'm not going into here, preclude a meteor explanation. But Kissinger was involved in this as well. Here's some other interesting CIA documents from 1976 pertaining to UFOs. I'm sure these are on John's website also. These have been out for a bit of time. One of them says the agency continues to monitor UFOs, but not officially, whatever that means. Another also mentions the fact, this is a quote here, that CIA's Domestic Collections Division has been receiving UFO-related material from many of our science and technology sources. So, one question might be, what sort of UFO material was arriving at the CIA's Domestic Collections Division? Well, whatever it was, it appears that there was active research and development being done on UFOs in the 1970s. That's a photograph, snapshot taken by a 16-year-old Iranian boy in 1978, June of 78. He was up late studying for his exams. He saw and photographed this object from the window of his family's apartment. This photo caused a stir among ufologists because it resembled a UFO reported by pilots during their landing approach to Tehran airport earlier that year. It also resembles that from 6 months later. Another young person in Iran, different part of the country, took this picture on the left. Enhanced, you can see it on the right. Now this picture was not revealed until this boy's family relocated to the United States 3 years later, and it was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request and a lawsuit. This was in the Defense Department files. This is the two of them together, just for your viewing pleasure. Moving along here. From late 1989 to the spring of 1990, how are we doing for time? Half hour, okay. There were hundreds of reports of lighted objects. Often these were described as enormous triangular-shaped craft recorded in Belgium. The most spectacular sighting took place on the night of March 30th in 1990. Thousands of witnesses saw one or more low-flying triangular UFOs with bright lights flashing in the center. These objects could fly as slowly as 30 miles per hour and accelerate to incredible speeds, multiple thousands of miles per hour. The Belgian Air Force on this evening sent 2 F-16s to intercept the UFOs, which were captured on several NATO radar stations. The jet pilots could also track the objects on radar and even see them at times. But the F-16s were thoroughly outclassed by these triangular objects. Not only could these accelerate at incredible speeds, not only could they stop on a dime, but they could change altitudes almost instantly. At one point, for example, radar installations and amazed witnesses saw one of these triangles drop about 4,000 feet in 1 second. It's almost a mile. The Belgian Air Force Chief of Operations, General Wilfried de Brouwer, added that there was a logic in the movements of the UFO. Now, to whom did these triangles belong? Despite the fact there is no official triangular aircraft that exists with that type of a perfect triangular planform, there have been a lot of people that suspect that this is an American project of some sort. The Belgians did ask the Americans exactly that question. Got the reply from the Air Force. No U.S. Air Force stealth aircraft were operating during the period in question. That's a carefully worded statement. No U.S. Air Force stealth aircraft. Well, maybe that's not considered stealth. Everything's very lawyerly when you get these military statements. Major P. Lambrechts of the Belgian Air Force General Staff did not appear to think these were American craft. He had wrote a report on the observations of UFOs during the night of March 30th, 31st, 1990. That's the title of it. Included a detailed chronology of events and dismissed several alternative hypotheses, including the aircraft thesis. And this is what Lambrechts wrote. The speeds measured at that time and the altitude shifts exclude the hypothesis according to which planes could be mistaken for observed UFOs. The slow moves during the other phases differ also from the moves of planes. Though speeds greater than the sound barrier have been measured several times, not any bang has been noticed. Here also no explanation can be given. Now, if these triangles were American, the U.S. Air Force made no requests to the Belgian government for any such type of mission, which it would have been required to do. More fundamentally, however, it still remains a challenge to explain these performance characteristics. Now, in the last few decades, it's become difficult to obtain current UFO reports through U.S. government agencies. John Greenwald described a lot of that. You can still get some But you can't, there's clearly a large number of events that are taking place that we're not getting them. It doesn't mean that the U.S. military no longer encounters UFOs, it's just that detailed documentation is not easily forthcoming. I have 5 minutes, is that right? Wow. Okay. Okay. I was going to mention the 1996 sighting that John mentioned at Griffiths Air Force Base. I'm going to skip that. But it does prove, as he pointed out, that the Air Force continues to encounter and report UFO phenomena. A lot more interesting than that, frankly, were the failed attempts by 2 F-16 fighters to intercept a bluish UFO near Washington, D.C. in the summer of 2002. That was on the night of July 25th, 26th. A lot of people saw this. They phoned their local radio station about it. The incident was briefly reported in the Washington Post. There it is. These objects under pursuit outmaneuvered and outran the F-16s and also disappeared from Air Force radar. The Air Force commented on this, that the object could have been any number of things. Of course, they don't tell you what things it could have been. I'd like to know. In fact, I spoke to the primary witness of this event, Rennie Rogers, and he works for the government himself. He came back, worked a late shift at midnight. He's hanging around in his living room at 1:30 watching TV, and he hears the jets. Runs outside, sees the jets in one part of the sky, thinking, what the heck is going on there? And then said, this was really not included in the Washington Post report. He said, to the left, at a high descent, a high angle of descent from the sky came this bluish object, bluish-green object, and then stopped. And he said, holy smokes. And then a minute later, the jets had turned around and were coming right after this thing. And the object, he said, just went bam, gone. Jets could not touch it. The Post article did not really give you that level of detail. Although Rennie has appeared, I think he was on the Jeff Rense show, and described this in some detail. So where's the official documentation on this? I don't know. There isn't. It's not out. This did not happen in the 1950s. This is post-9/11 America. You get an object of extraordinary capability that eludes interceptors in the vicinity of our nation's capital, with only the barest of whispers from the nation's media. What is going on here? I thought we lived in a republic, in a country where people had a right to know such things about what their government's doing. I mean, I understand national security, but how much national security is necessary to put a blanket over our head so that we don't know anything what's going on? Some people say, oh, well, you know, they're hiding their secret technology. They're waiting for the oil to run out, and then they'll replace it all with free energy. And I think, well, if you're very trusting and optimistic, I hope you're right. I'm not sure if I want to wait till the 11th hour for the government to bail my sorry butt out of the fire with free energy. I'm going to trust them to do that. Go right ahead, trust them all you want. I'm astonished by this. Is a very blithe kind of cavalier attitude that some people have. I don't see that. I mean, look, you've had people. Is this the next slide here? Here we go. That's a real picture. That was taken by Gary Schultz, who was quite involved in UFOs for a while in the early 90s. Gary Schultz is outside. He hears Bob Lazar on the radio talking about Area 51 and going out on, I think it was Tuesday nights. He said, all right, I'm going out there, man. He expected to see this huge crowd of people there, and there was no one there. He was astonished. He goes out with his lawn chair. He's with his wife. And he sees this thing come up. It's one of 6 objects. He took this picture with a cheap camera. Came out rather well. That's not the best reproduction, I'm sorry. It's my own. Just for comparison's sake, there's a couple of other UFO pictures it looks very similar to. But this was at Area 51. This is U.S. military on the left. That's one of our things. This object flew in unconventional manner, non-aerodynamic fashion. So what is that? No one in the media wants to follow up. We got something there. We got something. This is one of the main questions that engages me, and I think most people, you get into this field long enough. Who do these belong to? Well, my answer, I think, is both. That's my feeling. We've heard about aurora. These are computer-generated images. We don't really know what the actual aurora looks like. We do know about a gentleman named Ben Rich. Many of you know who Ben Rich was. Ben Rich succeeded Kelly Johnson as the head of Lockheed's Skunk Works division. Ben Rich was most famous for the stealth fighter, the F-117 Nighthawk, as well as the Have Blue stealth prototype, top secret F-19 stealth interceptor. In 1986, John Andrews, who himself was a legendary Lockheed engineer and a chief model kit designer for the Testor Corporation, wrote to Ben Rich about UFOs, 1986. Andrews basically asked him, look, are they ours or theirs? Not are they real, that's a foregone conclusion. You go to the classified world, you start talking to these people. It was one of the real jarring experiences that I had shortly after my book came out, with UFOs and the national security state. A lot of these classified people, talk to me and I'll say, yeah, I like your book. And you start getting into discussions and it's taken for granted among a large number of these people that UFOs absolutely are real. Anyway, Andrews says, well, are they ours or theirs? Rich said, well, both. He confirmed also to Andrews that there are two types of UFOs, the ones we built, the ones they built. We learned, he said, from both crash retrievals and actual hand-me-downs. Rich said the government knew and until 1969 took an active hand in the administration of that information. After 1969 Nixon purge, Rich said, administration was handled by an international board of directors in the private sector. He also had an impression of Kelly Johnson and of Kelly Johnson's contacts. He said that the few times that he discussed this with Kelly Johnson, that factions from out there were a threat more than they were a blessing, and that the cost of having them around was unimaginable and unbelievable, in Kelly Johnson's words. Ben Rich also believed, according to his statements to Andrews, that the public should not be told about UFO reality and ET presence. He believed that people could not handle the truth, ever. Ever. Only in the last months of his life did he begin to feel that the International Corporate Board of Directors, as he called them, dealing with the subject, could present a bigger problem to citizens' personal freedoms than the presence of the aliens themselves. Now, Andrews died in 1999, a couple of years after Rich, and then passed this information on to UFO researcher Bill McDonald. Ben Rich made another statement that has been recorded by other people. I happen to know one of the people involved in this whole encounter. Ben Rich spoke at the UCLA alumni, School of Engineering alumni thing, whatever, 1993. He was near the end of his life. Talked about the history of Lockheed, black projects, and so forth, and ended it with the statement, we now have the technology to take ET home. And stopped. So everyone, of course, crowded around him after this. Huh? What? And according to one person who was there, who told this to a man that I know personally, this has made the rounds of the email. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen this. Rich said, we now know how to travel to the stars. There is an error in the equations, and we have figured it out and now know how to travel to the stars, and it won't take a lifetime to do it. It is time to end all the secrecy on this, as it no longer poses a national security threat, and make the technology available for use in the private sector. And then a paraphrase, there are many in the intelligence community who would like to see this stay in the black and not see the light of day. You have other rumors. Everyone heard of Bob Lazar, of course, but Bob Lazar is the tip of the iceberg as far as Area 51 leaks are concerned. During the 1980s, before Lazar was even known by anyone, aerospace journalist James Goodall cultivated a number of inside sources from Groom Lake at Area 51. He asked one of them, do you believe in UFOs? Source said, absolutely, positively, they do exist. At a later date, that source told Goodall, we have things in the Nevada desert that would make George Lucas envious. There's Star Wars technology for you, quite literally. This is 1980s, guys. Confirmed? No, not confirmed, but there are Area 51 is maybe should be renamed the land of leaks, or the land of controlled disinformation. Who the heck knows? I admit you can't take these people blindly at their word, but I think you'd be a fool to dismiss it out of hand as well. This has to be looked into, especially when you're in a situation where you can't get these documents that you'd like out of the government. You just can't do it all the time. That is our choice for the future. I happen to believe in this thing called a constitutional republic. I don't believe that we are yet ready to give it all up in the name of empire. I don't. I think that we have the right to inquire from those responsible officials about this. My fear is that these responsible officials are not responsible for this topic. My fear is that this topic has become so far removed and is so deep black that we're like driving on this highway, but we're not steering the car anymore. Who's driving the vehicle? Well, I don't think it's us. So that's a problem. But I don't believe in giving up. Absolutely not. How we will obtain, if we are able to obtain disclosure, is the topic that I'll be discussing when I come back here this afternoon. And I will be speaking at 2 or 2:15, I think. That's all I have to say right now. I thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.